All right, so we have to settle something that's been debated for a long time, but the theologians at this point now understand and have for a while that the lost Jews, the lost tribes, was always some additional mythology that was not part of the actual biblical text. Okay, there's no lost Jews. First of all, they're the scribes of almost every empire in world history. They're not getting lost. If anybody's getting lost, it's the people they had on their slave rolls, because the Jews were the tax farmers and the slave masters for almost every empire. Now, it's said that they're only given this job because that's all they can do, because they're alienated. But when you're given control of all the financial resources, control over where people are migrating, control over which slaves are going to get to breed or not, I mean, you're really in charge of what's going on. But I'm going to end this now with facts. I'll pop up sources on the screen, but I'm going to freestyle this. Just wrote this out. We're going to answer some questions today. Who were the Jews? Who are the Jews? And where are the Jews? Okay? Now, this is very simple. The Jews are not a factual creation or an actual people group until around the time of Cyrus. Before that, every theologian knows they're a band of different Semitic cults that worship different cult gods or worship different Lord feudal systems like Belu, Baal, Kalu, Kohens, right? They were worshiping those systems and ancestors, and then later, when they went from oral to written, they started making it a lot more doctrinal and official. Now, the first Semite invaders into that region that are tied to this Jew population that you want to call Jews are the Akkadians. Okay, they invade Sumer from the north, from Turkey region, and they're allies with the Hurrians in Turkey. Do you understand? They're not allies with Sumeria. They put ropes on the throat of the Sumerian kings and walk them around the town before they kill them, tear down the walls, and let the Amorites come in. Who are the Amorites? The successor to the Akkadians. Where are the Amorites from? Canaan. They're West Semitics. They're West Semitic people going down and taking over Babylon and Iraq. For the Akkadians, who in the 4.2 event, 4.2 kilo year event, there's a weather event, causes the entire region to turn into desert and Egypt, and it leaves an opening. But their cousins, who they were aligned with before they fell as a leadership, but they're still part of the population and language, were Amorites, who are also aligned with the Hurrians in Turkey. Okay? The Hurrians are the Hittites before the Hittites came. They joined the Hittites and merged in with the Hittites, the Luwians, the Mitannis. All right? The Amorites, what are they known by? Martu, West Semitic Canaanites, Amu, Asiatics by the Egyptians. And we know Haran, Turkey, is where Terah, Abraham come from, and Noah's an albino from Turkey origins, okay? So we're talking Caucasus Mountains. All of Turkey is a bunch of mountains. The Caucasus Mountains, okay? Where all Caucasians originate from. Their male line comes from the Caucasus Mountains. And their female lines, but the female lines in a lot of these regions now that consider themselves Caucasian are overwritten by male intruders, and they still have their indigenous female lines. It's rare that they replace the male and the female line. Okay? Now, the Amorites are causing trouble all in the region, even before the Akkadians took over. They're mentioned in 2500 BC by the Sumerians as invading Semitic nomads who never bend the knee, never know a home, and eat raw meat. That's what they say to them. They don't bend the knee, they live on a horse, they never know a home. Who do they become? The Hyksos. The Hyksos joined the Mitanni, they joined the Kassites, they joined the Amorites, they joined the Shasu Bedouin Arab nomads. Now, the Hyksos are the ones that invade Egypt, and they also have people called the Habiru. The Habiru were merchants. It was more of a class than a people group. Okay? They're traveling merchant nomads, Habiru, like Hebrew, okay? Which a lot of people think it becomes. Habiru was known not only in Egypt as the invaders, but also all through the region, from Iran to Turkey. You had Habiru. Now, who do the Hyksos, Mitanni, Kassites, Amorites, and Shasu Bedouin Arab nomads become? The Sea People. They also recruit from Greek sources. The Greeks, you see, had collapsed in the Bronze Age collapse. The southern Greece collapses to northern Greece Dorians, who are coming from a filtering of Proto-Scythians that are coming from both sides of the Black Sea and settling in Turkey, where you get Phrygians, you get Cimmerians, and you get Scythians here. But the Phrygians come this route, Cimmerians come this route, Scythians, who supposedly pushed them, both settle next to them and then join this confederation of the Persians. Now, when we come back over here, the Sea People destroy the Bronze Age, okay? That's a combination of Phoenicians, Canaanites, Israelites, the Proto-Israelites, because at this point they're not Israelites. It's 1200 BC, roughly. Then after the Sea people, all these people have been settling and invading the region. There are DNA signatures that pick up and they dissipate as time goes on. They're high in the Bronze Age, low in the Iron Age. Those people were a gaggle fuck. Okay? The gaggle fuck becomes the Jews. Now, all the previous men of these confederations are overlapping and settling the Mediterranean and taking over all the ports and all the silver bullion trade. Who took that over? The Assyrians and the Phoenicians and the Greeks. Because the Greeks, or Achaeans, as they would call themselves, Achaean comes from Hyksos, which is a Hebrew word, not a Greek one. So when you see Hebrew words in Greece, it's because a lot of settlers were from Syria. Okay, the founding Greek myths, Cadmus coming from Phoenicia, Heracles coming from the Syrian region, all their stuff, Apollo coming from Turkey, it's coming from the East, and we can see in the DNA signature of the Y-DNA of the men that come, right? As the further along we get in history, as the takeovers of Greece layers happen, we know there's Minoan, Mycenaean, and then there's the Dorian, Spartan, Scythian types. Now, as they get more, what we call today's Europeans, as they get more white, right? They bring more Eastern Turkish DNA with them. The women remain the same because women don't travel for war, normally. It's men replacing as nomads. They replace the old men, rape the new women, make new babies. That's their new seed. Okay? The gaggle fuck becomes Israel. Israel's part of this gaggle fuck. The rest of it is settling in different places, like Ethiopia, Arabia, and Yemen. The Sabian Aramaics take over the male lines of those darker nations, and then now they're a Semitic people. The Hebrew religion is not natural to Ethiopia. Black people did not create Hebrewism. Even in their books, Noah's an albino. Do you understand that? An albino Turkey boy on a boat is a Canaanite, or a Syrian Canaanite Phoenician type. That's like the rest of those northerners, and what are they doing? They're invading, they're colonizing, they're replacing male lines. The Africans weren't working like that. They still don't work like that unless they're given weapons by the CIA. Now, when we get over here, 650 BC to 750 AD, Scythopolis is built right next to Israel. Let's take a zoom into this. All right, I can't even erase this. This is Israel right here. This is Scythopolis, right? You can't get from east to west to Egypt, where they're taking all this extraction from, these new Persian confederations, Assyrian confederations, and Babylonian confederations that are overlapping. All their scribes and money men are from Phoenicia, Syria, because they just took the silver bullion trade, and they have the best navy. So they're the navy for the Persians. They're helping the navy for the Greeks. They're helping the navy for the Italians. The Italians hire Jewish Hebrew sailors, and there are Jewish pirates always in this region causing trouble. You understand? Now, here's the thing. When we talk about who are the Jews, you have to say Scythians live right next to the Israelites for 1,000 years, from 650 BC to 750 AD. The Torah is not written until 450 BC. So 200 years before Torah, you have the Scythians living right next to the Israelites. A Scythian would never let a black man live next to him, so you know Jesus is not black or brown. Scythians were coming from the north on horses, and they were murdering everything in sight, and they were also the police for the Greeks. We know what they look like. We've seen their images. A lot of times they had red hair. They always had white skin. They're a master of horses. These horses are from Kazakhstan. The Dom 2 horse. The Dom 2 horse from here, and the Santasha chariot from here. These two things take over everything in the goddamn world. At this time, this gaggle fuck is being formed to become the Jews. So when I say all Eurasians are partially Jew, from their own accounts, they all claim Noah to start. What is Noah in himself? Noah's a Jew. So if you say Noah is your forefather to all your tribes, you're all, by extension, Jews. But you know who's not the children of Noah, never was, and is not even counted by these people? Is the people of everything outside of what got taken over. Everything this way that has been murdered, enslaved, and taken over for the last 3,000 years was not Noah. And it's not even Ham. Ham is this shit. They're just the laborers extracting the slaves. They're the lowest caste, darkest people for this Eurasian albino Noah light-skinned conference of people in the north, no different than NATO and the northern hegemony that we have now. You understand? So when they leave, you have the 450 BC Torah era. That's when they're writing the Table of Nations, because orally, from 3000 BC to the 450 right, it's all oral, fragmented, little novell-having fragments of an oral tradition, what is really just keeping tracking of where they invaded and where they have other lines that they can reconfederate with later. which you see them doing this constantly. They'll leave one region, rejoin it together, invade a new region together as two opposing forces, but really working for the same aims. All right, so 20%, so when we get 80% become Persians in the greater Persian Empire. So don't just say Persia itself. Persia was running everything from India to Tajikistan to Turkmenistan, over to Armenia, over to Turkey itself, and Greece, okay? And then Greece and Rome absorbed the Jews that did return, the 20% or the 40,000 in the 400 AD era. They were 40,000. By 100 AD, Rome sends 80,000 of those Jews to Spain with a Nazi prince exarch. So they go settle in Iberia, okay? That right there, 80,000, that's probably half of what duplicated itself here. When they left with 40,000, they probably became 160,000 by the year 180. 500 years later, they easily got 4 times their population, right? So half of them go to Spain, okay? And Spain forever is a Jewish nation. I don't care what anybody says. The kingdoms of Leon, Castile, Aragon, they're constantly a Phoenician, Celtic, Iberian, Jewish population running around Europe, getting more light as they're up further north, and they become what most people call Ashkenazi, and then later they get a Sephardic branch from the Islamics, and then those two spread in 2 different directions and split the world themselves. Okay, the Ashkenazi and Sephardic divide is a fake divide. They're working together, they always have. Now, all right, so the 80,000 Jews that we see going to Spain is half of them. What's the other half? What does history tell us? Now, the other half tells us that Rome in 70 AD started massacring some people in Jerusalem, okay? So where did they go? They mostly went up to Turkey. Some ran down to Ethiopia. Some ran to Arabia. Some ran to Egypt. Some ran down to Ethiopia. And then some of them went to Turkey. And they stayed up there in Turkey, where Constantinople would be coming soon. And they always had roots in Turkey, okay? So that is that leaving Jerusalem 70 AD, where the Kalanomis family says they left Jerusalem at the destruction of the temple. And they have a piece of the temple in their home in Germany today. In their home in Germany today, they have a piece of that temple from 70 AD. And they wrote most of the religious texts for the Christians and the Jews. And the demonology text, the esoterics text, the Kabbalah text, a lot of what we know in physics is coming from one family group, who's the Kalanomis family, which is from the tribe of David, which has never been lost. They've been the admin for Charlemagne. They've been the admin for Charles the Bald. They've been the admin for the viziers of the Islamic Caliphate. They've been the viziers for the Islamic Caliphate. They've been the Dianes, the Gayones, and the Nazi exarchs, which are the Pope and the King of the Exile for the Jews for 2,000 years. Okay, and they've changed their name from Kalanomis, and they've intermarried with other lines and take those names, and they have about 12 names they rotate, which I explain in another video, and those are the leaders of the global diaspora who all know who they are, and they know where all their workers are at, and they know what they can handle in merchantry. They're running trade and industry like they always have. Even then they were merchants. Habiru, traders. Canaanite means what? Merchant. Canaanite means merchant. What did the Assyrians call themselves until 400 AD? Canaanites. We call it Roman Syria. We call it Syria. They're Canaanites to themselves. The temple of Saturn was the temple of Baal. In the temple of Saturn, they worship Marduk. In the temple of Saturn, they worship Kronos. In the temple of Saturn, they are worshiping Baals, Kronos, and all the things that Syria had already, Rome was adapting from. Rome gets their arch from that Syrian, Canaanite, Phoenician zone, and the Phoenicians helped build Solomon's temple. They helped build David's temple. They go on slave capturing missions in the very biblical text itself. Okay, they're intermarrying. The Phoenicians are intermarrying with the Jezebel line is marrying into what is his name? Jahab? What's his name? Jahab or something like that, or Joachim, one of them two. They marry into Baals and Bels 3 or 4 times from Phoenicia. Then they marry into the Persian princess lines 13 different times from my account. In about 1,000 years, they marry into the Persian royalty, Zoroastrian lines, and even will take the name Magi as exarchs. Because the Zoroastrians and the Magi's, the Zoroastrian Magi's and the exarchs are very similar in structure, nature, and belief. All right, so we left off explaining the exarch lines. And Google and simple searches will tell you that the exarchs were just a Babylonian entity and the Gaons were just in Babylon. They had brother networks where 3 brothers would be Gaons. 2 brothers would be an exarch, 1 brother would be a Gaon. That's like having 2 kings of an exile in different locations, because there were at least 10 to 12 lines that I've told you about in other videos that were exarchs in Europe and Asia that are kings of the exile managing Jewish populations in foreign empires. they're still communicating with the head Jewry in Babylon, with the head Dayan, the head Gaon, the head exilarch. But there's sub-exilarchs, which are Nazi princes. They're still treated like Nazi princes. They're still in letters being called Nazi prince by European royalty. So they're treated with the same level of respect as a European prince. Now, we covered those people. What we didn't cover was what happened after the destructions of the temple, right? Where did they go? So after the first temple destruction of 586 BC, most of them went to Babylon, as we all know, right? The Daniel story, where they go under Babylonian rule. And that's the same time Babylon's actually ruling in real history, right? It's the transition between Babylon, Persia, and Assyria back and forth for just about 100 years. Now, some go to Khorasan and Bactria, which is over here in this region, right? Where they're taking up Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Pakistan, okay? Now, that's where you start to see the early trade routes into China, right? They're trading from China to Israel because they still had their destroyed temple trading grounds. They still had the connects there. And they're bringing glass doll beads, which they were the best glass makers in the world. That's a good way to find the continuity. The best glass makers in world history are always the Jews. They've always been the Jews. And they got exclusive contracts in Europe where only they could make glass. That's one thing they always do when they get the Vizier control. They give themselves monopolies on a lot of different trade. So some of them went over to Khorasan, to the Khorasan area, which is Bactria basically. And then some of them went over here to Babylon, in the capital for Persia at the time, Babylon at the time. Then Persia takes over and they allow that. The Jews help facilitate that. Now, what happens after that? I told you 20% go back to Rome. I showed you how some of them went to Iberia. Now, the destruction of the Second Temple, where else did they go besides Iberia with the 80,000? Now, hold on. The Chinese early assimilation was from the trade with the Levant and the glass beads that I told you about. That's where we get to our China board. And we get to the proto-Kaifeng Jews, which the Kaifeng Stele in 1489 gives the top 20 Jewish clans that the Song Empire allowed into China, right? Now, that was in 1489, but they know, they all, Chinese and Jewish sources say it started around 1000 when there's a decent-sized source of Jews in the trade routes. And there's a choke point where they took this region. That's a choke point. There's a lot of mountains here. The Himalayas, you have mountains up here. You have to get through here to get into China. That's what makes China a safe place for a lot of times in history, because they have that. They have the natural geographic barriers that make it hard to invade. Now we get the Li Lao Lo, which becomes Li like Bruce Lee and Jet Li, right? Those Jews that are the number one family on the stele. Back then, the order of the stele, the order of names in a list, gave you the significance in China of who was the most important, right? You had the Shi family, which she's also lion, sure is lion in Persian, and there were Bukharian Jewish people over there, and they were Persian speaking, and Shi becomes Stone or Stein, like you see a lot of Jews with the last name Stone or Stein. Well, Shi in China is that equivalent. They have A, Gao, Zhao, they have Jin, Zhang, which is also Chang, okay? They have Zhang, like Moshe Zhang, Xing Wang, who's the modern spokesperson for China. You had Jiang turn into Trang, and even Kandra and Cho in Japan, right? They are everywhere. They went everywhere. Everywhere you start to see the same similar writing and deities and mythology, it's coming from this dispersion. And I'm not saying these people aren't creating their own thing. What I'm saying is there's a new wave of invaders or infiltrators that are changing things, and that's when we start to see the record change, okay? So this 586 leads to the early Chinese assimilation, and you can't see the difference between them after a century or two. That's what happens with most of the Jews in all these diasporas. They assimilate. Iran's Wikipedia page says that they blended into the population where you can't even tell them apart. That happened a long time ago for a lot of different countries. That's why Ethiopian Jews look different than regular Ethiopians that are still from some of the native lines, right? That aren't as admixed. Now, where did they go in 70 AD? Here's the top 10 locations they went to. Babylon. They went to Italy as thousands of slaves. I told you about the 80,000 that went to Iberia. They went to Greece, where the Kallinomises already had roots as Cleonymus, as you'll know from my other episodes with the Cleonymus and Cleomenes, Spartans. And the Spartans and Maccabees write to the Jews, and they're saying they're brothers with the Jews. The Spartans have always been an endogamous, niece-marrying... I'm not going to go. Look, so then there's Turkey, there's Egypt, there's Syria, which is Phoenicia, Canaan. They went to Libya, they went to Germany, they went to Yemen, and even they went to India with the Cochin and Bene Israel Jews, which are debated, but their mythology, their history says that. Now, that's around 70 AD, and they say they have a shipwreck origin for these Cochin and Bene Israel Jews. It was a shipwreck which matches Phoenicians traveling. And Hebrews and Phoenicians, we might as well call them the same people. Using the same language. They're using, both have a Kohen priest system. They both are using West Semitic language. They're right next door neighbors. They're intermarrying the royalty. They're hiring each other's mercenaries. They're both slaving in a similar fashion. They're both the main slavers of all of the Mediterranean, or the Jews. Solomon had 120,000 slaves. So the main slavers are the Phoenicians and the Jews. Now, and they're next door neighbors. Now, what does the Bible migratory record show? It shows in 800 BC to 500 BC. It's the Bible and the migratory record show this. That the 800 to 500 BC, the Phoenicians leaving out of Tarsus in Turkey with Celtic galleys, right? They were with them. And Israelites, who are their travel allies. David did missions with them. And the Israelites speak about Tarshish. Tarshish, Tarsus, and Tartessos are ports made by these people. The Celtic galley, the Israelites, and the Phoenicians traveled together to Spain. Okay, that's where you get the Iberian Celtic people, and you get Baal worship in the south of Spain, and we have overlap, same cities with Celtics and Phoenicians, and then they spread north. So after 500 BC, we get a Tartessos earthquake, and then they decide to go north, and then they go inland into the river systems, and then they start to colonize from 500 BC. They're colonizing Europe through the river systems and come back down to Italy, and then help form some early Italian state. And eventually, by 300 BC, they worked their ways back to Turkey, where they came from. Now, some of them were already just going back and forth from Turkey, but some took this route and then came back over as they came into Greece. They came over here into Turkey. Now, they already had Celtics. I told you, the Yamnaya period in 2200 BC, when the same time frame Sumeria's getting taken over, there's already the Proto-Celtics, Proto-Phoenician, Proto-Scythians that were going this direction with the bell beaker and the corded ware. Now, they had routes, and Phoenicians had secret trade routes and maps where they could get to England. They taught Greece how to get to England, and they kept it a secret with their maps because they like to control the trade. They got tin from England. They got their purple snails from Spain. And they had been in that route since 1200 BC. I'm saying Phoenicia. Phoenicia is Canaan. The Phoenicians never called themselves Phoenicians. They called themselves Canaanites. Okay? So we keep thinking them in our heads, that's the Canaanite era. That's the Phoenician era. No. There was some change in leadership. The majority of the population is still the population. Now, so Canaanites are speaking the same language, are doing the same God worship from El to Baal to all the things that the Bible stories start to change later and try to clean up and act like they're not related to. Now, we start getting names of things up here, like Atropattis, right, for a city, like Atrabazis down here. We're getting similar things in geography that I've tracked that scholarship is behind on, okay? But people have theorized, one or two people theorize, and then they ignore it. Because scholarship likes to move slow, and they don't like to base any mythology combined with the migratory record, usually, unless it's like all they've got. But they have DNA and other things going on. We have Celtic galley priests in 400 AD, eunuchs, because the Celtics were major eunuchs in Turkey, right? And they were right next to the Syrian border, and a lot of these people were in cults like Atrahasis, Attis, Astarath, Ishtar. All those cults were making eunuchs, and they had male priests serving a female god, but it really wasn't. It was a perverted version of the old feminine goddess systems, or the balanced male-female. They made it so the female gods were always the underworld goddess, and they made it so that the male servant to the thing, instead of being a priestess, like they used to have in Egypt and Sumeria and everywhere else, it was female priests because they're more intuitive, they're more spiritual. They got rid of that, and they made these transgender Kalu priests, which became Kohen priests, which became Galley priests. Kalu was also Gala in Babylon. Okay, they were a transgender priest that never had a wife, never had kids, never had a home, but they took kids. And then they merged that into a demon, which they later had Kalu, Belu, and Gala at the same time. Belu becomes Bel, becomes Baal. Okay, and this thing is spreading as the populations are moving. They're just taking this bullshit everywhere they go. Okay, so what happens next? That's just the destruction of the temples, right? Now, that was the destruction of the temples and the Phoenician presence we already had in Europe from the earthquake in 500 BC that sinks Tartessos, which is a major trading port with the Greeks. Okay? Now, the same time, let's talk about what was happening back in Israel. Now, while these destructions were happening, who was really in Israel? Well, there was Scythopolis or Decapolis from 650 BC to 750 AD, right? They were the Scyths in Persian. They called them Sakas. Saka 3 different ways. Sakas of the sea, Sakas of the horse, Sakas of the something else. But the Persians and Darius called themselves Sakas. So they themselves are Scythians that just learned how to read. They got stable in the region. But the Scyths themselves, this constant wave coming from the Santashta zone and the Yamnaya zone. This constant wave coming down is making this bullshit happen, which is later Khazaria. And later where the Huns are coming and taking from Attila the Hun. Now, all right, so the Scythians, they're working for Persians, they're working for Greeks, they're working for Romans in Scythopolis or Decapolis, which is a major gold and weaving center. Okay, it's a major trade area in Israel and Jordan. All right, now they're all under the employment of those empires, and they even overtake Rome eventually as the Magister Militum, and they overtake Rome as the generals of the military, and they're living in the outskirts, and they keep managing Rome from the outside and extracting from them. Byzantine Rome eventually hires these Scythian horsemen who are basically taking up north, going up to Europe and managing Rome. Byzantine Rome uses them to manage West Rome and Europe, to be their forterati and collect taxes. What else is happening? Scythopolis is next to Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and it ran to Iberia, Armenia. It ran the Iberian state of Armenia. It was called Iberia then in the Roman times. In 300 BC, it ran that for a few centuries. Now, they also had Scythians that went all the way to Sakistan, which was Pakistan. You had Sakistan right here north of India. Boom. With these long-head Alchon king Scythians called the Indo-Sakas or Indo-Scythians. Those became the Alchon kings, and they practiced cranial elongation, which the Huns did. Remember, the Huns took over Europe. The Alans did. Remember, the Scythians become the Alans because when the Scythians go away, the Alans pick up their DNA and they're religious more than any other group of all those barbarians, okay? And then the Alans eventually join the Goths, the Huns, and they go west. And they take everything. The Alans coming from Iran, and Alan meant Aryan, okay? So we're talking about Aryans and Scythians. Iranians, Scythian horsemen. Alans coming from here took over everything, came down to Spain, took over that, came over here, took over the north, and eventually, when the caliphate took over and Islam came, they just became Islamic. Because they're fair weather, fake religious people. They became Aryanized Christians, where they were being able to put their Magi system bullshit and all their other nonsense shaman prayer worship into Christianity. It was an easier format than the Eastern Orthodoxy. And then you had your Alans that joined the Eastern Orthodoxy. You had your Alans that became Muslims. You had Alans playing all kind of games, but the real Alan core was a Scythian sun worshipping type of group. Okay? Now the Alans, Goths, Huns managed all of Europe for centuries, and then what do they become? They become merged with the Carolingians and the Merovingians, who become the Holy Roman Empire and become Germany, Austria, and eventually unify Europe for the first time with Charlemagne. Charlemagne calls Kalinomus, who I told you was the David line, and he calls that family to manage his serfs in Europe. So when Europe's finally colonized completely and given Christianity through these fake-ass horsemen that are faking to be Christians, then they get a Kalinomus serf from Babylon, and Italy, not serf admin, that gives them a serf system that brings the Lord system, and Baal is just Lord. So they brought that Baal shit, like bullshit, from the Syria-Israel region. They brought it up to Europe, and they were like, we're going to make sure you can serve your people and keep them as debt slaves on the land, like we did to the people under Hammurabi, under every one of these asshole Semitic leaders, the Hyksos and Joseph's 20%, the Hittites and their 20 to 40%, and their allies. They basically are a traveling tax farming pride of lions, if you think about them that way. Why is it always the Lion of Judah as their symbol for the Davidic line of Kalinomus? What is a lion like? Think of a lion. A lion comes in and replaces a male lion. What did the Yonaya do? Come in and replace male lions? And then what did they do after to replace a male lion? Put the women and children to work for them. Or replace the boys and have the women work so they can eat off them. So the women are picking cotton and farming, and these new male-dominant prides come in, and they live their life out there like a wild pride, having to replace their father. Those Kurgan, Scythian, Alan types had to kill their dads to take over oftentimes. So did the Celtic Dionysian priests. They had to kill the next highest Dionysian priest to become the high priest. So they'll kill their own fathers, they'll kill their brothers. They don't give a damn about their people groups. That's the fucking force that they have at that time. The Jews don't care about their Jews. The elite Jews do not care about the rest of the Jews. They sacrifice them all the time. They use them for exiles. They use them for colonization. They use them to go set up trade routes while they're dying out here fighting wars. The Bible itself says like they're afraid to go colonize the Philistines, and then they kill 2/3 of the men. Everything about what they're doing is Kurgan, Scythian, Mongol-like horse nomad stuff coming from Ukraine, which is where Deus Pater comes from. And you better go back and watch the religious series because I explained all that. All right? Now, what else happens with these Scythians? So not only are they over there in India, not only are they there in Armenia, in Iberia, they're also traveling as Celtics. What did the Celtics call themselves? The Galati, or the They became Gaul in France, right? But they called themselves Galati. What did the Jews call their diaspora? The Gola. Galati, Gola. Now, the Galli was a priest of the Celtics. The Galati was the people of the Celtics, and it was like a way of life, right? Now, these Celtics were always migratory, and they were like priest lines. They were a priest group, but they were also slavers. They also made eunuchs. They also headhunted, okay? Israelites, like a priest group, also slave people. Phoenicians, very religious, also slave people. You understand? And what do they also all have? They all had a stone that they would circumnavigate like the Kaaba, because there's a black meteorite stone thing that they take all through Europe, all through Asia, and it was found as far out here as Bactria, where the Bar-Makkid exarchal line ran this, where we're going. They ran the Sassanid Empire. And what do we have? The Sassanians, the Sassanid Empire and the Parthian Empire end, and the Caliphate begins. That's just a coincidence. But then, when the 750 AD Scythopolis earthquake happens and Scythopolis ends, guess what happens? They go to Babylon, and then guess what we get? The Abbasid Caliphate, the Abbasid Revolution. 1 year later, we get the Carolingian Revolution, and then for 10 years, we get a Carolingian Abbasid treaty where they work together in a war against Byzantine, Rome, and against Spain. So the Europeans, who were just Alans a minute ago, are now working with the Parthian, Scythian Alans, who are now the Abbasid Caliphate, and they're treaty together, and you're like, why would they ever be treaty from here and here? Well, these motherfuckers just came up here and became those people. They just replaced their male lines again. So, and then at the same time, these Sakas go over to Tibet. They became the Shakya clan in part, which has worship of snakes like the tribe of Dan, which are Scythians, and then the sun, the worship of the sun, and the worship of the tree like Buddha. Buddha comes from the Shakya clan or Shaka clan, which Shaka is another form of Saka. Saka is another form of Scythian. So Buddha, with his blue eyes, is a Scythian Kshatriya warrior from the most powerful warrior clan. But their DNA is more like Brahmin, more Aryan than the native populations, which are more H, okay? H haplogroups. They have a lot more R1A and all these things. Green eyes, blue eyes, R1A, because they're an extraction force that came in and they took over India. They took over the governments, or infiltrated the governments to extract from China, extract from India. China, not so much. China was like its own mini world, okay? But India was a constant, like Africa, a constant pipeline of caste systems where they would just have their own local people administer the system that they brought to them, by blending in with one system and then keeping it endogamous where they can't marry out. The Brahmin are just like the Kohen priests, where they marry and they track their male lines. So it's the same thing. Abrahamians and Brahmins are doing the same thing. And this is what happens. And the Jews are not missing anywhere. They just blended into Libya, Germany, Yemen, India, into all these other people and religions, because they were never that strict about what religion they started in the first place. When they were Jews, they were always jumping over to Baal worship or Yahoo worship before Yahweh, and all kind of other things were going on. So they don't care if they're chameleons. But what they do have is a common Canaanite core, and they have a community-based thing like the Zionists do. It's more of a community-based thing with the elites. Okay? They're not really Jews. They were something before they're Jews. They were Kalu priests. They were always something before that, shaman. So that's just one mask of several that they wear, and they became all. When they get into Italy, they get into all this. These slaves eventually get their own longest-lasting non-exile population in the world. The Italian Jew population is the oldest Western population of Jews that has a continuous presence. And even when they would exile Jews all over Europe, they would not exile papal Jews, and they would not exile certain elite Jews, and they usually always give them a chance to convert. So of course they say, well, convert, and in 50 years you'll forget what they were doing. They'll allow us to be Jews again. So practice quietly. So that is what happened with the Jews. They became everyone, in part by taking over through male lines and jumping in with Scythians, who they were part of, jumping in with the Persian Aryan Alans, who they were part of, the Sassanid warriors